As you said, into the unknown. As you can tell, Frozen has been playing a little too many times in my household over the last couple of months. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to give some opening remarks, but then really want to get to who everyone's here to hear from, the experts and the panelists that you just heard about. So before I jump right into it, one of the things I want to say is thank you. Thank you to all of the frontline responders who have put themselves at risk, as well as the state and local governments that have had their backs over the last couple months. I think you'll hear in the next slide, I'm a big basketball fan. So as Kevin Durant would say, you all are the real MVPs. So where it started, again, to kind of give some remarks, is the March 13th, 2020, which odd, it was a Friday the 13th as well. I was actually on site with one of our customers to meet with their procurement leadership staff. And the day before that, March 13th, March Madness was canceled. Like I said, I'm a big basketball guy, so cried myself to sleep that night. As everything was starting to happen and close down, March Madness was kind of the tip of the iceberg. Needless to say, the meeting the next morning didn't go as planned. Chief Procurement Officer and their leadership team were pulled out to start responding to basically overnight going to shift to a virtual workforce. So fast forward a couple hours, I'm on a plane, staring out the window, the last time I was on a plane, flying back to DC. And on that flight home, it was, starting to reflect on some of the questions of how would this affect people across the world? The economy, the jobs. What about our customers? How would this impact their kind of where they were in their process? How would this impact procurement's role across the public sector, which we'll hear a lot about on the panel today? And what would the new normal look like? And I think the biggest thing when you look at some of the opportunity that's come out of the new normal is, would some of this change be here to stay? And then selfishly, for me, doing a lot of travel, it was an opportunity to get out of the plane, stop traveling so much. Except about a month in, I sent an article, a link to my wife in the morning as a little joke, and kind of backfired. The next thing I know, she came down wearing a sweatshirt. And as you can see, the article I sent to her highlighted one of the points of an invisibility sweatshirt. So what has been highlighted during this? So one of the things that, is the government's tipping point. When you look at digital government, it's nothing that's kind of a new concept, but really the acceleration of the adoption of digital tools to support a new virtual workforce. We've all heard and probably read Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point. I think given the current economic conditions and what COVID brought on was really that forced tipping point. And we see both ends of the spectrum, some still having somewhat of a paper-based operation, some that are fully digital and have adopted tools, and some with a mix, some paper manual processes and legacy systems, but really bringing that together through the lens of how do they enable the workforce. Emergency preparedness. So I think this goes outside and just highlighted the response, whether it's emergency procurement, the need for PPE equipment, and how procurement responded. Each state has its own emergency procurement, but when you look at kind of the things that needed to be enacted to support the frontline responders, make sure they had the goods needed to keep people safe and then safe, it was kind of a couple things we'd see is from a supply base, were they able to quickly look at their suppliers and know who could support emergency procurement needs. One of the other big things we saw across states and across agencies was inventory on hand. So not only going out and looking at net new purchases, but did they have visibility up and down their supply chain into inventory on hand where they needed to replenish or they could pull from inventory to support the emergency preparedness. And then the next one being procurement in the future workforce. So I think, we all say the new normal, but I think portions of this are here to stay. And some of that being good around the digital, kind of what they've accelerated through the digital procurement. I think one of the things that probably sticks out is, that Friday when I came home, a whole state was going from physically located in the same building to a completely virtual workforce. And so telework, that's, rare in the public sector, and technology plays a role in making that happen. But I think what's unique is it's forced organization and vendors to focus on the human side of digital transformation, at least as much as the technical side, and including new ways of working. And then supplier risk and performance, I'm going to go into that on the next slide, is really when you're identifying the supply base and expedited but diligent. So again, do we really need 20-page questionnaires? Kind of trying to eliminate some of the red tape, but making sure all of the controls are there and in place to make sure the vendor is vetted diligently as part of that onboarding process. Qualify, requalify, and pre-qualify. So looking at your existing supply base, we had customers that went out to their vendors with an RFI to requalify, because as we've seen, some suppliers have retooled, some to make sure their businesses are still viable and stay in business, and some direct response to the COVID-19 situation. And I think the other piece you see here is from a local preference, supplier diversity, how do you build qualified lists so in future emergency responses, you have a qualified list that you can pick from while including the local preference and supplier diversity. And then the last one really around restructured contracts. So when you look at the impact that COVID has had, I mentioned the economic impact, but the loss of revenue for states and how can they leverage procurement, not only from a value standpoint, but also to potentially be a source of additional revenue. So we've heard a little bit this week about the performance-based contract, value-based contracting, which is a huge shift versus looking at it simply as a contractual document. But we also see the focus on potential expansion of cooperative agreements or cooperative strategies where that becomes a revenue income source, as well as policy or legislation evaluation for whether it's admin fees to look at, again, bringing revenue in as part of the overall procurement function. And then again, robots are not going to replace us, but from a technology lens, really what we're seeing based on the new normal is self-service as the norm. When you look at just moving from kind of a centralized model to that decentralized model, making sure that the tool sets and the toolkit that you have for your employees are intuitive. They want to be able to log into an application, whether it's submitting a purchase request, but be able to do it without lots of hands-on training. But do more with less. So again, really trying to be more efficient. And the continued automation. Again, not replacing, but moving to a more of an exception-based process, not checking the box for the sake of checking the box, but really having the tools in place which flags information within a process that it requires your review. And then the next two go hand in hand. You have more and more data in public sector. We've heard all about the open data transparency. That's been a focus over the last couple years, but I think really what we're seeing is open architecture. There's not a one tool, one platform solves all. It's really within your toolkit and solutions, which ones play nice together and integrate, where it's really that open architecture and optimizes the solution set for state and local governments. And then we talked about the focus on value creation versus cost savings. So really looking at value-based, performance-based contracting. And then really in closing, our team talks about opportunity. And this is an opportunity to continue to deliver on our promise of partnership. And one of the things I like to harp on, and again, it's my bad Frozen joke, but as we all press on to the unknown, remember, we will get through this together and we'll be stronger on the other side. But in the meantime, don't forget, be kind, be helpful, and be human. And with that, I'd like to hand it back to Scott so we can get to the wonderful panel we have in store for everyone. I appreciate everyone's time.
Well, Mike, thank you very, very much for that. Be kind, be helpful. And speaking as the father of 3 young daughters, I think I can sing the soundtrack to Frozen 1, Frozen 2, or Frozen 3 if that's out yet. I can see various people agreeing with me on that front. They also sing Hamilton at the top of their voices and hoping that their British father will play the role of Mad King George. I'm yet to do that on camera, but if we make the right donations to the right charity, maybe I'll do that one time. So my name's Scott Wayne. I'm a moderator and facilitator, and we partnered with NASCA for this series to co-produce this event between studios in Lexington, Kentucky and Richmond, Virginia. I'm in the Richmond studio here right now. But I will say I'm having a few flashbacks to my first arrival in the United States when I was a young diplomat and I was posted to the United States with the mission to influence government policy here in the United States. So that would be lieutenant governors in in Louisiana, but I was actually based in the consulate in Los Angeles. And so I was trying to bid for UK contracts for the LA Water and Power Department. Tui, your predecessor, I would have been trying to influence to buy UK goods. And Ed, I also covered Arizona, so spent a lot of time flying back and forth to Arizona to try to hustle with you all. And now I've got to hustle you for real, genuine opinions. So my job is to break those speaking points and get some good, gritty reality here on camera for the members and participants of NASCA. So I'm not going to ask you to do introductions. I'd love if you could weave into your answers sort of the perspective of your role and just give us an update on that. But Ed, I'm going to start in Arizona, and I want you to think about as we dove into this crisis and you had to transform the way that you were operating government to respond to this crisis. What policies and procedures did you find that you had to reinvent? And interesting, did you have to go to legislatures to do this, or did the bureaucracy allow for the changes itself within state and city government?
Yeah. Hey, Scott, thanks for the questions and for the panel and the audience. It's a pleasure to be here from the great state of Arizona. Wish for a little bit cooler weather, but hey, we can't have everything here. But happy to be here on the panel. So I'd like to start with some thoughts and some comments on your questions there, Scott. So I'll start with when the pandemic hit, March timeframe, whatever, for Arizona, and I'm sure all other states, it caught us all kind of by surprise. Basically, the health needs basically doubled, you know, in the state of Arizona, if not more, because of the COVID activity. The federal stockpiles that came in fell short of the PPE commodities for our state entities and our hospitals. So we had some you know, we started at the bottom, if you would, and we had to find ways to fill those pipelines because of those shortfalls. We also found that when the distribution took place of the federal stockpile in Arizona, products that came into the hospitals were vintage shelf life, you know, products. Some were like 2009 N95 masks. Hospitals reached out to us and said, hey, we can't use these. We tried to put them on, the air loops broke off, type of thing. So obviously some challenges with the federal stockpile going forward. But the good news there is I was able to participate in a health association briefing where they pulled in the admiral from the Pentagon whose sole focus is in supply chain and logistics. And what a great presentation. It may be online someplace, I could probably try to find that. But boy, it brought back memories from my Boeing days of working with the military, making sure the soldiers had all the products they need, our logistics went well. This guy's gonna do phenomenal, and I expect the next federal stockpile is gonna be a positive thing for all of the nation, if you would. So I wanted to start with that. And I look forward to seeing more about how that admiral moves forward, if you would, out there. So we'll start with that. So what did we do in Arizona? So the pandemic immediately gave us an eye-opening that we needed to identify, you know, better processes, better understanding of customer needs. How are we going to better manage the inventories? How are we going to do our procurements going forward? So we had to step back and assess that. And while we did that, we immediately partnered with our Department of Health Services, FEMA, and our agency customers. We stood up a health emergency operations center. We stood up a state emergency operations center, one to cover the health requirements, one to cover the state entity requirements, if you would, for first responders and other folks there. And we then sent out a survey across the state. In the state of Arizona, we support 122 agencies, councils, boards, plus all other state entities in Arizona. So it's pretty huge. It goes across 15 counties. So what this survey did is we asked all these state customers, what are your needs for PPE? What type of requirements? What are your current inventory levels? You know, so we can gain that information before we reached out to our suppliers to solicit help. We had a very good idea as to the volume that we were going to need. And obviously it was in the millions of quantities, right? So the challenges we had is you had the federal government had first priority of all the inventory at suppliers. I mean, that was a given. Then you had the global outreach and the national outreach to those suppliers. So we're starting from behind here with the supply base. So we had to tell ourselves, boy, how do we go do this? How do we go vet all these new suppliers? How do we get our current supply base in? And so the changes in policy, no real legislative changes, Scott. What we had is our great governor, Doug Ducey. He identified the appropriate funding buckets for us to work with our state customers. That was very handy in helping us get commitments, get purchase orders out there upfront to a lot of suppliers who may had some capacity, may had some available inventory. And I can talk more about that in some of the other questions there. But clearly a lot of challenges for the state of Arizona, but we found a way forward. And the important thing is working with your state customers and keeping that communication chain open and understanding the government regulations, the different buckets of funding like the CARES Act and grants and things like that. So we pulled all that together to try to help us move forward. And the process is going fairly well right now.
Ed, I love that. You're keeping the communication flow going with the state, leaning on the feds where you can. And I loved your commentary that Governor Ducey sort of created the buckets from you all to draw from. It's a very visual description. And maybe that's a segue to Jay. Jay, you've worked both as on the administration side, as you are currently, but also as a lieutenant governor. What does that look like from the inside in terms of making those choices? But also, these crises are often opportunities for innovation. So in Louisiana, of the things that you've changed as a result of the crisis, what are you going to keep for the long term?
Thank you. And first of all, let me thank all the folks who are on the line and the state workers and governmental workers, local government workers. We've certainly seen during this pandemic how well the public sector has stepped up, an often unappreciated area, and it certainly has been eye-opening for me to deal with this from the position that I'm in right now. Keep in mind, at the outset of the pandemic, Louisiana was one of the hardest hit earliest states. We had more cases pro rata early on in the first couple of weeks or month of this event than anywhere else in the country. So we were slammed very early in the process of procuring as many items as we could and we thought we would need, as well as standing up temporary hospitals. We had to, in essence, procure a hospital inside the New Orleans Convention Center. So our procurement staff was challenged very early on. We were obviously under an emergency declaration, I think as everyone is, and that affords us some flexibility in procurement. I am blessed with an excellent procurement staff, a great director, and she's got some great folks working with her who helped us navigate the difficult waters in the early days. We had a request for qualification process that was established so that we could, we didn't suspend our procurement code. We still had to follow certain provisions, but we obviously had to act quickly, and we were acting extremely quickly, but we were still trying to make certain we afforded opportunities for competitiveness and for getting different qualifications and quotations in particular from folks who could help us build a hospital and staff a hospital and get the necessary PPE that everyone was looking for. And as Ed mentioned, this was not a localized disaster like we're used to in Louisiana with a weather event. This affected everybody across the country. So we're all clamoring for the same stuff at the same time. And it made it a very difficult challenge to navigate the federal overlay, trying to gather PPE and nevertheless making states and localities be on their own to get what they could get. So that request for qualification or request for quote process really helped us. And it's something we're obviously going to be continuing going forward. We're all still dealing with this. So we haven't had a chance to fully step back and reflect, do an after action assessment of where we're going. But I think we can all probably agree that the new world order and the new normal is going to include meetings like this, a lot less travel and a lot of dealing in this virtual world. And that is also going to affect the procurement process, because I think you're going to see, as we've seen here, pre-bid meetings and conferences taking place by Zoom and requiring people to participate this way, this being the exception, being the rule rather than the exception. I think that's probably the most dramatic change that we're going to all have to experience going forward. And it's certainly going to take the procurement sectors and all of our organizations to take a close look at their practices and their policies and seeing exactly what changes are appropriate. I can't tell you exactly right now how many of the things that we're doing in an emergency context are going to be carried over into the new normal, but I dare say it's going to be a significant amount of what we're doing right now.
Yeah. Mike, can I throw this to you? Are you seeing, as Jay's describing there, a change in the way that the public sector is interacting with the private sector? And what do you suspect is going to continue from those, that emergency style, so to speak?
Yeah, I think there's definitely been more collaboration, for sure. I also think sometimes where you think about public sector, I highlighted the do more with less. So I think when you look at across public sector, especially now, looking at just the impact of budgets, but we've always dealt with whether funds have been pre-encumbered, encumbered, or budget cuts have been. Public sector is one of the most innovative groups there are out there because they're used to looking at finding budget or doing more with less. So I think you're kind of seeing a leapfrog effect where some of the kind of what I said forced tipping point is a lot of organizations were thinking about this digital transformation, maybe some of the things that we would think were standard on the private sector side, but really adopting it and adopting it fast. And then the other thing, I mean, we're on it now, Zoom. Jay highlighted it too, we were talking about it earlier, is the ability to just kind of not miss a beat. And whether it's a Board of Public Works procurement review for a critical procurement, still making sure that whether it's an emergency procurement or standard procurement, the right controls are still being facilitated just in a different avenue or platform.
Yeah.
Scott, let me add one other thing that just came to mind. As a matter of policy, we would not prepay for anything. We were all clamoring for the same items, and there were a lot of vendors out there demanding or at least requesting some prepayments and pay us in advance, give us money down. We just didn't do that, and we were very worried about that from a competitive standpoint because everybody was after the same thing we were after, but we were very reluctant and just as a matter of policy to do that. I'm sure other entities did prepay on some things or had policies similar to ours, but that was one of the biggest, toughest challenges I think we faced at the outset of the pandemic, where we all seemed to be competing with one another for the same limited resources, and it made it very challenging. But I must say there was great coordination among organizations like this one and others, and the National Governors Association communicating as a group to Washington and trying to speak with one voice so that we could deliver that message as we balance the federal role versus a state role versus a local role.
Yeah, Jay, that's fascinating. And I think as we think about future sessions at NASCA and in collaboration with NASPO, is how you better improve those communication channels. And of course, given my nationality, we were seeing the same thing on the other side of the Atlantic with European countries outbidding each other for the same material, particularly from China, and literally racing Air Force, cargo craft out there to try to get the first bid. It was quite the scene on both sides of the Atlantic. The innovation, I think, that you're touching on is fascinating because it does go from sort of a national and state level down to a local level. And Tui, I'm going to bridge over to you now. As a former resident of Los Angeles, I know that LA Water and Power has run endless scenarios around forest fires, earthquakes, but pandemics, that's a new one, or at least a new one outside of a Hollywood studio. What innovations have you seen in terms of procurement in Los Angeles that you've been impressed by, and maybe what have been a couple of mistakes or bumps in the road?
So as I believe Jay mentioned earlier, we have a charter like that has kind of really saved us, that we have written in where, we have our mayor has mandated that it was emergency, because oftentimes our charter dictates that, like a lot of government agency, that we go through a competitive bidding process. So declaring it as emergency kind of really helps us, I wouldn't say bypass, but accelerate our ability to make purchases quicker. But to give a little history, LADWP procurement, as the way we process things, works in two dichotomy, where I support the business side of our e-procurement system, where half of our system internally, like creating the PO, making the recommendation, the rec side, is all electronic, automated, streamlined, seamless. But then our other half, to no fault of our own, resulted in that we had to work from a outside or public perspective, like the vendor management system or the solicitation part was a very manual, very labor intensive. And when this pandemic hit, it kind of, our GM was like saying, oh no, we need to close our vendor liaison center, which is where our vendors were dropping off of the responses to our solicitation. And then of course, you know, our mail system can be unreliable because it kind of, we're unique in a way where it goes through a different post office before it comes into our office. So, and our said, well, got to be timestamped by this deadline or it's non-responsive. So with this pandemic, we closed out the system. And so that, what do we do now? And that's where a lot of, like, our partnership with iValua came in, where I was challenged with, how do you fix this, TUI, in a sense where now that we close this off, but now how do you offer a secure and transparent way for our vendor now to submit responses? So I started reaching out to a lot of my contacts, Mike and Jane being one of them from iValua. And in the end, we end up partnering with iValua to help address some of these procurement pain points. And in a matter of 5 weeks, I think one of our big success was to take it from that side of manual dropping solicitation to now having a virtual box for our vendor to submit private, secure, transparent process for our vendor to see in a matter of 5 weeks. It was a lot of the painful process in that, where bumps we learned was, like, you know, part of our charter requires that at the time of bid closing, we do a public bid opening. We had some ups and downs with our WebEx issues, technology issue, because our buyers then have to translate. Well, I used to go down to the office and read out the bids. Now I got to do it through this new platform. So it was part of that, trying to build in that mechanism where now, hey, you know, when the bid opened, it's transparent now. You guys don't even have to deal with that. But at the beginning, we had to learn that when the pandemic hit, how to use WebEx, how to get our vendor to sign on to WebEx, how to transition our vendors into this new procurement workflow and lifestyle. So, but we are getting along, and partnership with iValua has really helped us transition to using technology to transition us into a place where we can now start to pick up businesses again and get into the flow of our normal procurement duties.
So I love the shout out to iValua. And Mike, heads up, I'm about to put your feet to the flames in a minute after all those good things that Tui said about you. Don't get comfortable. Tui, I think this is fascinating. I would guess, having worked in this field just a little bit, that the reason you had a separate post office was actually an anti-terrorist move, that probably coming from the anthrax attacks, that you're putting a third party between you and the civic office. So it's interesting that one crisis contingency actually got in the way of you responding to another crisis contingency. And Mike, here it comes. So Jay touched on sort of request. He politely said request. I suspect it was almost demands for prepayment. How, you as a sort of advisor and intermediary in this, how do you protect from the public sector being gouged by the private sector when there's all of this pressure from citizens and residents to get the material in place where it needs to be? What do you do in that role to bring that transparency that Tui was talking about?
Yeah, so I think it starts with the access and transparency to the data. So being able to look at kind of the using historical data, not to just overanalyze, but use that more in a predictive nature to look at what is fair and open, what suppliers are providing. And then really what we've seen a shift in, and we talked about a little bit of the performance-based contracting. So not even technology focus of just how the procurement mindset has looked at specific performance and milestones, and using that as a part, and looking at vendors that are out there from a true partnership. You know, ourselves, and I know other vendors from a support standpoint, really partnering to support and be there to help organizations like this. So kind of Jay alluded to the prepayment and some of that, which is, you know, from a materials and getting goods in, but also where there's something that from a control, transparency, and access to that data, if there's a model where you can defer payment or have kind of that trial, use a platform to support that. But really what we've seen is it's the data, but data where it's actionable, being able to look at what's historically been purchased. And again, the big piece is the supplier vetting, not to come back to that, because there's your existing supply base and new suppliers. You have kind of there's a difference between, having an opportunity or being opportunistic. And so that's really where you got to strike the balance of looking at how you vet your suppliers. Again, that it's expedited but diligent. And that really starts at upfront onboarding of the supplier to kind of the analysis when you're looking at actually making an award.
So not getting swamped with the data, but using data as actionable intelligence to pre-filter and ensure that you're going to get the relationship that you need.
Yep.
So Tui spoke about shifting from an in-person paper-based system to a digital system and onboarding suppliers to WebEx and the like. Ed and Jay, I'm going to come back to you. What about digitizing your own teams and how you operate? I assume you're working on remote bases in Arizona and Louisiana. How are teams living up to this, and what are you doing to drive that performance and mental health of your employees? Maybe Ed, we start with you in Arizona.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Scott. First, I want to just add on to Jay and Tui's comments. The state of Arizona, we would not allow any advance payments. I got so much pressure from the governor's office, agencies who were reached out to by new suppliers. And I mean, the pressure was pretty huge, but we have a strong procurement policy in Arizona. And from day one, we brought all the procurement administrators, CPOs together and said, look, we're going to stay the course here. We're going to find product for these customers, and we're not going to do advance payments. And to this day, we have not done that. We've still been successful following the procurement process, if you would. Okay. With regards to, the new working from home, keeping people, performance going forward, making sure we stay on track. We still have our standard metrics, scorecards, business reviews with our customers out there. The one good thing we have in Arizona is, I'll go back to the governor again. When he came on board, he brought in these new tools. Mike is familiar with this, the Arizona Management System. And what these tools did is it helped you identify your projects, what were the problems, how do you track those, how do you measure those, how do you communicate those to your customers. And these were live walls in various divisions where you had regular huddle boards with your customers to keep track of things going. When the pandemic hit, Scott, what we did is we digitized those, and we now do virtual huddles. And these huddles take place in 15 minutes. We go through a standard deck of activity with our customers, and the customers love it. So that's kind of how we transitioned.
That's great. And it sounds like everybody's seeing that as an improvement. It was a forced change, but an improved change.
Yes, it was a continuation of where we were going with the AMS tools, and everybody does this. You lean out your processes, you drop your lead times. Customers appreciate getting their products quicker, not having a one-year solicitation out there on the street, if you would, right? So it's about the continuous improvement here in Arizona.
Jay, in Louisiana, you described earlier being at the forefront of the outbreak, and some of those numbers were staggering, especially clustered around New Orleans. So you're pushing your employees to virtual operations. How did that impact the performance of your teams?
Not surprisingly, working at home is proven very popular among employees. There was some initial concern with supervisors about accountability and about how you would manage, but really it's been a very good experience in the height of the pandemic. We were not prepared to have as much virtual work as we had to have, but fortunately we had a stockpile of computers because not everybody had work at home equipment, but we had enough resources on hand that we could get into this new world order pretty quickly. And we had to, because as you say, New Orleans was a hot spot and Baton Rouge was right on the trail. And Baton Rouge, of course, is the capital where most of the state employees are. We have several high-rise buildings downtown where there's a concentration of state employees. And obviously those buildings were sparsely populated during the height of the pandemic. And really now that we've had this resurgence, but we were able to transition to it pretty well. And everybody seems to be doing all right with it. We know that one of our after action efforts is going to be looking at this very issue, because I think long term it's going to have a profound impact on commerce in America and really in the world, as you see more people, private sector, public sector, saying, I can get this job done working at home. I don't need to lease as much office space, for example, or build as many buildings as we now have, because more people are able to be productive at home. And I think that'll be a real cutting edge discussion that we'll be having over the course of the next several years as we react to what's happened.
Yeah, and I imagine not least because the pressure that's going to be on state budgets as a result of the expenditures you've had to.
Well, that's right. But of course, it also affects those in the private sector who are leasing buildings or who are dealing with government and seeing a shrinking government overall, and a change in the workforce utilization of space is all going to have a bearing on both the public sector and the private sector.
Tui, staying on that subject, you're based in a very expensive city where assets and real estate come at a premium. Which technologies have you used to run virtual operations, and which do you think you'll keep that may have implications for reducing other costs down the line?
Well, before I start into that, to add what Jay was saying, he's lucky enough where he had a stockpile of like laptops. Unfortunately, we did not, you know, and a lot of these parts, as you can see, came from China, like our processors. So we had, in a matter, had to order like 2,000 laptops for an employee. Luckily for mine, just in the sense of my group, where we do a lot of presentation, I had a lot of my teams go straight to laptops versus desktop. So my group was a little bit minimally unaffected, but a lot of our procurement staff worked on desktops, and we have dual monitors, huge dual monitors. Now, how do we address those if they're working from home? We had to buy adapters for people so they can project stuff on like maybe their TV. That's what I was doing when I was at home, taking my laptop and projecting my screen onto the laptop, because we're working in multiple screens, buying webcams. And shout out to our IT, you know, department, because they were a huge, crucial, you know, player in this pandemic, because they had to think about remote access for all 11,000 employees. How do we get webcams for everybody? How do we clear it so there's no cybersecurity issues with the webcam, because they're connecting, you know, through our intranet. But those are some of the challenges we were facing with technology. What we are keeping, I think we had to switch to a lot of, like everybody else's, virtual-based meetings, WebEx, training. Prior to the pandemic, I already started piloting, because I'm part of, I run the purchasing card program in my group. And so we started digitizing signatures on forms. And we started that as a pilot, but that kind of COVID-19 kind of really helped me trying to push digital signatures within our division. So then we started creating digital signature for our contracts. So that's something we'll also probably moving forward, we'll continue to keep. Right now, I'm also part of the ERP project. We're looking at, you know, software vendors and upgrading all of our systems. So we're working on that project to bring us into, you know, new technology. We will probably continue to work with iValue to maintain and support, you know, our solicitation and vendor management of the system. We're trying to go digital with a lot of things, because the biggest safety concern with a lot of our employees are paper touching. You know, like if somebody else touched something and I'm touching something, then, you know, this virus may, you know, potentially be on this paper. So we're trying to limit the amount of paper our employees have to touch. So we're digitizing a lot of our paper-based processes. Yeah,
it's interesting. Prioritization of technology over whether we touch it or not seems to be a determinant of investment, at least in the short term. Mike, before we move on.
Hey, Scott, can I jump in? I think one of the challenges we're all going to have going forward, the state of Arizona recently did a survey to all employees, you know, upwards of 30,000 employees in the state who are working from home. There was a 95% positivity about working from home. So as we go forward, yeah, we have the challenges of reducing the footprints of buildings, things like that. But going forward, if folks are going to be asked to come back to work, that's going to be one of the challenges we have, because people are getting comfortable, and as long as they have all the tools to do their job from home, that'll be a challenge moving forward.
So
what goes, sorry, I'm going to add to Ed, what goes into this is, I'm not sure you across the world, but especially in Orange County, you know, schools and districts are debating whether we go all virtual with our class, and everybody on this panel have kids, and I'm one of them where, like, how do I continue to show up into the office or work from home, but then support my kids who are also going virtually? That's the added challenge into this workforce that we're going to have to deal. And with DWP, we have set things in place where we have a policy for modify, where you can apply to continue being, if we ever like fully go back into the workplace, we also have exceptions for people. They can apply to be on modified telecommuting to support parents who are working parents, but also have kids who can't be in school. So
Right. Yep.
yeah, that's
Yeah, this intersection of technology and how we live our lives. I was reminded a couple of days ago by a historian that modern day schooling came around as a result of the Industrial Revolution, which was a place for us to put our kids when we went to factories instead of working from home. And now we've reversed it. There is no school, so we've got to step away from the factories. What are we going to do about that? I would like to kind of move a little bit to communications in this. We talked about communications with employees on a basis, but you also have political masters to work for. And Jay, if you don't mind, I'd like to lean on you here because you have played both roles. What has this crisis forced in terms of communicating with governors and lieutenant governors and elected officials in cities across the state? And then Ed, I think I'd love to throw that question at you as well in terms of, you know, Arizona is an enormous state with some large dense pockets and then some dispersed pockets. How are you just handling communications across states your size and so complex, both with state politicians and local politicians?
Yeah, definitely. You want Jay to go first?
Jay, Jay, let's start with you.
I'm sorry, you want me to go? Okay. Well, it's critical. You know, unfortunately, we have a lot of experience in Louisiana with disasters and with crises, and that's usually they're limited in geographic scope and in time scope. A hurricane comes in, it hits a certain area, it's over, and then you have to react. Well, in this case, obviously, we all know everybody was impacted, and so there was an immediate need for strong communications from the state level to the federal level, and from localities who are looking to the state for some direction. And obviously, a lot of questions and conflicts arising as to gubernatorial authority versus mayoral powers and local government decisions that are being made. That's something that we're dealing with in Louisiana right now, and tensions between various branches of government as to who's in control and who does what. There's been a great line of communications, as I mentioned earlier, with the organizations providing a lot of the assistance in dealing with Washington. We all dealt with the CARES Act, and it was an unprecedented dumping of dollars by the federal government into our budgets. Usually the feds are going to reimburse you after you've spent some money. In this case, they're sending money, they're transferring money directly into the bank account for the state, and in some cases to localities as well. And then you've got to deal with how can you spend it and how can you make certain you're not going to spend it improperly so that there's a clawback a year from now, 10 years from now, whenever the government gets around to looking at whether you followed the guidelines that were issued. So it really stepped up the importance of the communication between state government, which I was involved in, and the federal government to make certain we got answers to questions. And we were all asking similar questions and we were all getting answers, and we got them pretty quickly, I must say, from the Treasury in terms of how you use the CARES dollars. That was the biggest communication challenge that was met fairly early in the pandemic. Because of our, you know, this is an annual occurrence for us. We have a very well-defined disaster management plan, what we call a unified command group that meets regularly in anticipation of a weather event or during it. That was activated and is still activated right now as we go through the pandemic. So we're meeting literally as needed twice a week, or at a minimum once a week, in the early days every day, to talk about the responsibilities of all aspects of government and which departments we're going to be communicating with local governments. And that became even more important with our state getting dollars that were to be redirected to local government because of the way the CARES Act was written. By and large, that communication, I would say overall, has been very effective from the federal level to the state level, from the state level to the local level. But we had an advantage because we're used to doing this, and we're used to dealing with FEMA on a regular basis. We're used to knowing how to handle federal dollars, and that gave us a leg up for, I know, a number of states and municipalities that don't have disasters as frequently as we do in Louisiana.
Who would have thought that a sort of expertise of state would be crises, that you're, because of
It has become an absolute expertise of the state, and our folks, our FEMA folks and National Guard folks are constantly going to other states to provide assistance and direction on as they're trying to understand and ramp up what they should do in the face of a crisis.
That is remarkable. Ed, I want to put a lens on the same question to you, but earlier today in a morning session, the Chief Procurement Officer of the state of Maine made the comment that we're in an emergency situation, but not everything is an emergency. How, through that lens, how are you differentiating to your stakeholders what really is that crisis issue and what isn't?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. First, let me start by saying, I work in the Department of Administration, and our director Andy Tobin, happened to be speaker for quite a while in Arizona. So he knows everybody in the state, and I mean everybody. I go with him off-site to League of Cities and Towns, and everybody's calling him by first name. He's taken us to the House of Representatives, the Senate, to meet everybody. That's how fortunate I have been in this role in the procurement office. And so we got to make those relationships with all these key state, senators, governors, everybody. So there's no shortage or lack of communication across the state. Our state also has what we call enterprise initiatives. The pandemic is one thing which we're all working together to focus on that. Other emergencies are, hey, we all have to run our business. We've got contracts expiring. We've got some great tools with our new procurement system, thanks to folks like Mike and others there, that we can keep everybody on track to monitor what's coming down the pike. The communication with our customers, a year prior to my coming to the state, customers didn't want to come to the state procurement office because they felt they were kind of taking up procurement's time, or they weren't wanted. That has all changed now. So it's completely a flip of the coin, where customer outreach is just every single day in a good way. I mean, so that's a real positive feeling. They see that the procurements are done in a timely fashion. They're not done manually, they're electronically. They get their information, they participate on committees with this. Before statements of work are built up, our customers are involved in that. They're on our VAL committees, okay? How do we keep in the communication kind of transparent is the governor has a weekly press conference, and he does that with the whole state. Some of you may have seen that and watched that. Then that press conference highlights are flown down in a weekly meeting we have with all procurement personnel within the state, with all customers within the state and the state entities, if you would. And then we have our weekly one-on-one meetings. I reach out personally to directors every single day, or vice versa, they'll reach out to us. I just think we have a really good group of state employees, customers who are really gelling and working together. So communication hasn't been an issue for us in Arizona.
That's great.
Can I piggyback on what Ed's saying? Is I think during this pandemic, I've noticed like the flow of, up, down, and vice versa. I've seen that flow has increased, like from our mayor to our general manager, down to our chief administrative officer, to my director, to us. The flow of information, because this pandemic, a lot of the things are unknown, and who it's touching, how it's affecting us. We want to know that, and sometimes with employees, they want more communication. Sometimes the image is that we're not getting enough from the top down. But I feel like they made it a top priority to make sure, they're communicating what's going on, what our leadership is doing to address safety concerns, talking to our customer. We have a vendor liaison center that's purely just to take calls from customers. I handle a technical help desk side to escalate issues and handle the internal customers. So we try to constantly keep the communication flowing, especially in this time where everything is virtual. We need to, keep everybody informed.
I love it. And speaking as somebody who lives in the state capital, I'm in Richmond, Virginia here. It's a terrible time to be a political handler, as all the leadership wants to talk directly to everybody in the front line, which I think is wonderful to watch. Mike, on that basis, what are you seeing nationally in terms of states that are doing a great job in communicating with stakeholders, but particularly in the private sector. We've been, what's not lost is that we're going through an enormous economic impact of this. Business owners are having to grapple with their own crises while also trying to serve the national interest. What does the private sector need to know from the public sector that helps them step up?
So I think the biggest thing, and we've heard our wonderful panelists kind of already hit on it, is the transparency and then the frequency. So obviously when this happened, there's still a lot of uncertainty, but the frequency of communication, and I think kind of that openness and directness that we've seen from just an overall, there's people not knowing how's this going to affect my day-to-day life. Tomorrow could change. And so just hearing directly, you mentioned, especially in the political world, hearing directly from those people in leadership and those positions, I've just seen tremendous value in kind of easing that uncertainty and making folks feel okay about what the next day has in store. So for me, they hit it on the head, and the most successful I've seen is really that level of transparency, but the frequency and the clearness of the communication, what they can expect. And it's okay to say, right, that we don't know right now, but we're doing X, Y, Z in preparation or as part of our path forward.
Yeah, would you speak a little bit more to, there has to be barriers put in place between the public sector and the private sector, but we're also asking for more collaboration. How do you find that balance between, having the fiscal protective barriers in place, but also allowing that creativity to happen between private and public sector?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at it, obviously there's different controls and there's different process around the public sector. But I think bringing all of that together, it's again, just like you would on any kind of high performing team, you get people in the room and the brightest minds that are speaking up and collaborating to end up with the best end solution. I think there's been kind of too much of a firewall between private versus public, and I think kind of, especially in just the nature of operations of the private sector being impacted just as much as the public sector, is we're really seeing a blend of that. But then some of the things fiscally that Jay alluded to is the difference when you're looking at and even on the federal side, when you look at small business innovative research and SBIR programs, you're seeing a blend where the government's putting these funds out there to support. And I think you'll see kind of the coming together of how the private and public sector are both using those funds, but also making sure that the control and fiscal responsibility is there to show that those funds are being used, for the constituents.
Okay, I love it. We've got a couple of questions from the audience that I'm going to close this session with. This has been terrific. Thank you all. One is around, you've talked a lot around the crisis has almost allowed for innovation and efficiencies to happen in the processes of government. What legislative or regulatory changes do you think are needed to sort of take these advantages and keep them going sort of day to day once we're out of a crisis phase? And I open that to all of you. Are there things that you think need to happen within state legislatures that allow for that nimbleness of government that you're experiencing right now?
Hey, I'll take a crack at that, Scott. For Arizona, what I've seen in the 2+ years I've been there, you have our Arizona procurement code. You've got to go compete things like Tui and Jay know this. But when you have these pandemics and these emergency situations, we have gone out and done some emergency procurements. We could probably do a better job working with legislature to add some things, into the law, if you would, that automatically gives us that right to go there. They do in some senses, but we could probably do more with the learning curve. And as we learn and go forward here with the pandemic, there's probably a little bit more we can do with the legislative kind of in that area, I believe, because we see a lot of private suppliers now wanting to get into the PPE business. And for us, where they've had product and we brought them into an emergency situation, at the same time, we told them right after this contract, we're going to compete you. You have to be competed, kind of a thing, right? So there's a little bit there. We could use some help with the legislative team.
So I'm almost reminded of Jay's comments around Louisiana having an expertise in crisis, that you're almost trying to create the rules and guidance for whatever crisis comes up next. It might be a cybersecurity incident, it might be Yeah, fascinating. We've got a couple of minutes left, and I love this question that's coming from the audience, which reminds me of that famous Donald Rumsfeld quote. But given there are so many unknowns out there, how are you doing scenario planning over what you should prepare for? And I put this to you. I enjoy meeting with these big strategy consulting firms that have their futurists, and I challenge them to see their report from 2015 that said that the star of Celebrity Apprentice would be leader of the free world, that Great Britain, while declaring it was a free trading nation, will have left the European Union, and that we'd all be locked down under a pandemic. So as you look into the future, how on earth are you doing scenario planning within your organizations for what you should prepare for?
Well, I can tell you in Louisiana, we're doing it as a matter of being forced to, because we're sitting here staring at hurricane season. All those on this call who are in coastal states, coastal communities, recognize the threat of a hurricane. And so imagine a major hurricane of Katrina nature, the other storms that we've experienced in the past decade, hitting any of our coasts in the midst of the pandemic. You're trying to evacuate coastal hospitals with COVID patients out of the storm harm's way. And at the same time, you're moving people into evacuation centers and trying to socially distance. The two are mutually exclusive when you think about it, but we have been having those types of sessions, talking about what do we do in the midst of this pandemic if and when that happens. This is projected to be one of the busiest hurricane seasons on record. August and September are typically the biggest months that we experience storms in the South, and particularly in Louisiana. And so we've been engaging in those tabletop exercises, not nearly as thoroughly as we normally do, because we're doing it while still dealing with the other crisis. But we've had to do it out of necessity, and that's something you just worry about. You know, we were going to talk about what's your worst nightmare. That's our worst nightmare, is a storm coming in the midst of the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, hey, Scott, I'll jump in on this too, along with what Jay has said there about emergencies. In talking to our hospital partners, we're all gearing up for flu season coming with this COVID situation taking place. So we're out there getting stockpiles of syringes, needles, vials, all those things that are used for the flu season, because they have a terrible feeling what's going to happen, you know, come this fall, and COVID's still going on. So we're trying to protect ourselves there and get a jump start to help them on those things. So.
With what DWP is doing, just because we're still in the middle of the pandemic, we're still planning for this pandemic to last however long it lasts. Even with the vaccine projected to come next year, we're still stocking up on hand sanitizer, paper towels, PPE equipment, gloves, you know, everything that we need for our field crew. On top of that, we also, like I'm pretty sure with every organization, we have an emergency management team. And every year we do this as an exercise. I'm not particularly part of it, but part of my executive team, everybody from supply chain, we have somebody from emergency management, we have somebody from each of our system, the power system, water system. They come in and they do these tabletop exercise. So scenario would be, okay, what if somebody hijacked, you know, our control system? What do we do? So they play through a scenario and try to, okay, what will supply chain do? What will power system do? What will water system do? So we go through this exercise in order to prepare us for these type of emergency. We may not address every single scenario, but we go through this exercise to help us prepare better and to help to better respond. So I think, you know, every organization have that type of exercise that, you know, and I think it's important that we do that, and they communicate when they get the results, they communicate it down what they have done. So I think it's a really good thing that our leadership is doing to help, you know, our organization stay focused and stay prepared.
Predicting the future. Good luck to all of us. But maybe I'll throw that to Mike to bring us home with respect to how Invalua sees the future. And what, well, let me put it this way. As a European living in the United States, I've had to deal with a lot of European questions. As Europeans suddenly understand the Constitution of the United States and realize that it's really the states that are at the forefront of this crisis and not national governments. What role do companies like Invalua and organizations like NASCA and NASPO play in terms of trying to take the lessons we've learned and share best practices over coming months for whatever is coming next? What are some lessons that we can take away from this, Mike?
So I think the first thing is sessions and the thought leadership series like we've been doing over the last couple of weeks are just of tremendous value. I think getting folks together and being able to share kind of experiences, what's worked, what hasn't worked, lessons learned is just so invaluable. And for me, that's kind of the biggest thing that I just love about public sector. Sometimes in private sector, it will seem that it's competitive intel or giving something away where there's really that true collaboration of, hey, how'd you solve this problem? Or in this case, how can we leverage suppliers maybe from state to state to get a better deal or make sure we have that stockpile in the future? And then from an iValue perspective, I mean, we really see it. We want to be a partner in that journey. And I think when you look at the technology ecosystem, it's really coming back to, Ed mentioned it, the AMS system in Arizona. That's not, that whole process, the lean system isn't an iValue tool, but there's parts that need to push in and play nice with that iValue tool. So I think it's being there as a partner and making sure you're just part of the overall ecosystem. I really like the quote earlier this week about, you have a strategy prior to taking on a technology investment and technology is really an enabler versus going and getting a technology and then coming up with your strategy. And I just think that's critical to the overall success when technology is just going to continue to play more and more of a role as we all kind of continue with the new normal.